Prohibition, United States, 1919. In 1919, 3/4 of the voters asked for prohibition in the United States, and they got it. The next decade saw moonshiners turning out alcohol in millions of gallons, rum-running ships rolling in the sea just beyond the 12-mile limit, waiting to transfer their cargoes of whiskey to fast cabin cruisers for the race ashore against the customs men. Booze trucks being hijacked on city streets by gangsters with Tommy guns, ladies and gentlemen drinking cocktails in speakeasies, 75 cents to those with admittance cards, free to police, and Alphonse Capone, multi-millionaire bootleg baron, driving about Chicago in an armoured car with bulletproof windows. The Volstead Act enforcing prohibition passed by Congress in 1919 went into effect at midnight on January 16, 1920. A fleet of liquor-laden ships almost immediately joyfully set out across the Atlantic to the United States to run the liquor blockade. The era of the rum-runners had begun. Breweries and distilleries in the United States were closed down, and federal prohibition agents were specially assigned to see that no liquor was imported. They were assisted by the Customs and Immigration Departments and the Coast Guard. But if all the prohibition agents at work had been strung out along the borders and coastlines of the US, disregarding illicit stills, home brewers, and other sources of internal liquor traffic, there would have been only about one man to patrol every 12 miles of beach, harbour, headland, forest and riverfront. Illicit distilling, alky cooking, alcohol brewing, as it came to be called, provided the most copious of all internal sources of supply for the bootleggers, with illegal diversion of industrial alcohol accounting for another 13 to 15 million gallons a year. 1 gallon of diverted alcohol, watered down and flavoured, was enough to furnish 3 gallons of bogus liquor bottled with forged Scotch labels and sold as just off the boat. And there was plenty of the real stuff that was, actually, just off the boat. Liquor shipped to the US from Nassau in the Bahamas during the first year of Prohibition was valued at more than $7 million. The rum-running vessels brought liquor from all parts of the world: the West Indies, Holland, England, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Chile, swarmed along the US seaboard, anchoring offshore without lights in what became recognised as Rum Row, which changed its locale from time to time and was always a danger to navigation. The preventative officers could not cope with the situation, and, in any case, the graft, corruption and turning of a blind eye started at the top. President Harding was in office in the first years of Prohibition. He was a good-hearted, handshaking politician of limited talents, an unlimited navyiette. Once a week he banished the cares of office by inviting a handful of cronies to the White House for poker parties at which liquor flowed freely. Harding's friend, Attorney General Harry Doherty, officially ruled the carrying of liquor on foreign or American liners within the 3-mile limit was illegal, but secretly trafficked in presidential pardons and liquor permits. Coolidge's administration, which succeeded Harding's in 1923, handled the rum-running problem as though it were dynamite, merely negotiating international treaties which increased the 3-mile limit to 12 miles and trying to improve the Prohibition Bureau without asking Congress for money. Freighters brought in cases of contraband gin mixed among cases of other perfectly legal and properly labelled commodities, and liquor was smuggled in freight cars and loaded trucks across the Canadian border. Prohibition agents succeeded in intercepting only about 5% of the liquor smuggled into the country. The amount involved in money or gallons could not be approximated. By December 1924, Doherty's successor, Attorney General Hudson, was saying that the smuggling and piracy then existing on the American coast made the stories of the 18th century era of piracy in the Caribbean fade into insignificance. Great fleets of vessels carrying reckless and lawless crews, he complained, sat offshore at various points in the Atlantic and Pacific, constituting a grave menace to the peace, health and prosperity of America. The work of the ill-equipped Coast Guard was enormous, so $4 million was set aside to improve the service. They were given 20 torpedo boat destroyers, 2 minesweepers, 223 cabin cruisers, and 100 smaller fast boats. The following year, 39 foreign vessels were seized, including 28 British and 4 French, and 753 American vessels were taken, all engaged in the traffic. Some were manned in part by foreign crews, but the actual smuggling itself was mostly done by American vessels and American citizens, although all nationalities engaged in supplying the actual smugglers, many of whom had vessels more or less permanently moored in Rum Row to act as depot ships. The early years of traffic transformed backwater ports such as St. Pierre and Miquelon from sleepy little fishing villages to busy rum-running bases for well-organised syndicates with their fleets of fast yachts and cruisers, each capable of holding up to 5,000 cases of liquor, enough to show a profit of $40,000 on each boatload landed in the United States. Some 15 or 20 boats often sailed together in convoy, while agents of the syndicates kept in touch with them from the American coast by shortwave radio, sending code messages to bring them in on the beam. All sorts of ingenious devices were resorted to get the liquor ashore. One company retained the workmen on one of the sewage barges on their regular payroll. The barge was fitted with racks below deck for the liquor, and when the sewage cargo was dumped out to sea, the rum-runners transferred their precious liquor cargo to the barge and had it stowed away in the racks, and so landed ashore. Neither coast guards, customs men, nor prohibition agents were likely to inspect the foul-smelling hold, but one night an earnest young officer insisted on going below for an inspection. It so happened that there was no liquor aboard that night, but the bargeman, resenting his zeal, by accident the young officer was locked below and forgotten there for 16 hours, and subsequently spent a week recovering in hospital. Big fleas notoriously have little fleas upon their backs to bite them. The regular rum runner operated outside the law, but more often than not operated honestly, but he was preyed upon by hijackers or pirate rum-runners who intercepted radio calls to the rum-running ships, went out in speedboats to meet them outside the 12-mile limit, and sometimes bringing forged orders for the consignment to be handed over to them, and sometimes by intimidation or even murder persuaded the rum-running vessel to surrender its cargo. The vicious dog-eat-dog character of rum-running and hijacking was the motive of some 500 unsolved gang murders. The most spectacular crime of the Prohibition era was the massacre of St. Valentine's Day, 1929, at Chicago, in which 7 members of the O'Banion gang, then captained by Bugs Moran, following the murder of its leader Dion O'Banion by Capone's men, was stood up against a wall and mown down by the machine guns of 2 gangsters in police uniforms and 2 other men. There had been incidents of Prohibition agents goaded to violence by their impotence to handle the situation, shooting to kill but missing the rum-runners and accidentally slaughtering innocent bystanders. Instances of Prohibition agents found murdered were also common. One case, that of the vessel I'm Alone, was typical of many international complications raised by Prohibition. She was an auxiliary schooner owned by the Nova Scotia Company, the Eugene Creaser Shipping Company Limited. On March 12, 1929, she cleared from Belize in British Honduras with a cargo of liquor, and on the 20th anchored 14.5 miles off the Louisiana coast. The US Coast Guard vessel Wolcott approached, ordered her to heave to for examination, but the I'm Alone captain refused to be examined because, being outside the 12-mile limit, he was not within the jurisdiction of the USA. To make doubly sure, the I'm Alone started further out to sea. The Wolcott followed in her wake. When 19.5 miles out, she again refused to be boarded, and started to put further out to sea, when the Walcott opened fire. The Coast Guard vessel's 3-inch gun jammed and rifle fire was ineffective, so she signalled for help and followed on the trail of the I'm Alone. At 250 miles out, the Coast Guard vessel Dexter came up and sank the I'm Alone. One of the crew was drowned. Everyone knew that the I'm Alone had never been used for anything but rum running, and it soon became apparent that the Eugene Creaser Company was controlled by Dan Hogan, who was himself controlled by a certain Big Jim Clark, well known in the racket. But international law had been transgressed by the sinking of the I'm Alone outside the coastal belt, and the Canadian government made representations to the US. There was a commission of inquiry, and after months of debate, the commissioners found that the mission and use of the I'm Alone were both unlawful, and that its sinking by the US government was also unlawful. No damages were awarded for vessel or cargo, but $51,000 was paid to the sailors and the widow of the drowned man, and the Canadian government graciously accepted an apology from the US. The borders of the US and Canada in the Lake Michigan area were also a busy theatre of operations for the liquor smugglers. Fast speedboats making the run from one country to another across the lake at night. Lake Michigan lapped Chicago, and Chicago nurtured Al Capone, who by 1928 controlled the sale of liquor in Chicago's speakeasies and was the main source of supply, it was said, from Canada to the Florida coast. As the profits rolled in, $60 million a year it was estimated, Al Capone floated to the top of the scum of the bootleg business in America. He acquired finesse in politics, had his own mayor in office, a bodyguard of 18 men, 700 toughs on his payroll, and gave orders to high politicians, judges, and the police. By the early 1930s, repeal of the Volstead Act seemed inevitable. Rum-running and bootlegging had placed the nation in pawn to gangsters. Enforcement, moreover, was providing a costly farce. The well-to-do had always been able to afford bootleg booze, and with the coming of the Depression, those to whom Prohibition had been sold as promising economic security, cars, houses, higher education, and higher standards of life generally, laughed sardonically as they stood in bread lines. The Democratic candidate in the 1933 presidential election was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal and a pot of beer for anyone who wanted it. He was elected, and on December 5, 1933, repeal of Prohibition was ratified. Sadly, the rum-runners turned their sterns on Rum Row and put into port to land their cargoes legally, but with the profits and romance of beating the law reduced to a mournful memory.